Thanks, Chris. And I also want to acknowledge that Paul Beyondich was critical in helping to introduce open health tools to the Rockefeller Foundation and its involvement in this. I really do appreciate the help that he's provided and many that I've worked with starting over the last year and a half. So, as Chris said, there's a project, the initial funding of which comes from Rockefeller Foundation, but will be pulling additional funds, that started with a concept called HEART that Carl Brown and some others had drawn up a concept paper, particularly Chris. And when it was conceived of, the purpose, which has not changed, is really to share, to develop a shared platform to foster the use of assets. And the word artifacts, we have chosen to use the word assets because we can communicate to a broader audience with that term, and because we've expanded the type of assets that will be part of what's there. So the original way that it got HEART, although I suspect HEART came first and then what it stood for, was talking about focusing on enterprise architecture. So health enterprise architecture as the kind of assets that we're going to be working with, and emphasizing the repositories and terminologies that are part of that. And it was focused, or when we first started the conversation, it was a repository to focus on non-code enterprise architecture assets. As we got into the discussion, and thanks to Jane Curry, who has really been adding tremendous value to understanding the requirements and relating it to other kinds of repositories that have been there. What we said is we didn't want to do yet another repository. That there are lots of repositories or stovepipes, and that rather than just doing something that was a non-code repository, that we wanted to come in and approach it a little bit differently. And so while the acronym stays the same, twisting a little bit more, that it's about the IT now asset, not just enterprise architecture, registry repository, because it turns out, as I'll talk about in a second, the registry, not the repository, is where the real value add occurs, and about tools that will help to populate that repository and registry. One of the things is, since that the value is the registry, the indexing, the analogy that finally got home to me that Jane was able to relate is the value that a card catalog in the library has for dating stacks, the asset, the book, whatever the library has. That if you have it there, if you don't have a way of getting to it, then it doesn't have much value. And not only in the standard library value where you're reaching for a single item, single book, but that the enhanced value is that in health IT there's an interrelationship across the various repositories, across the various standard assets. So if you have this requirement, you have these types of enterprise architecture needs, and there may be these types of solutions needing certain subtypes of information assets. And this interrelationship is something that even a card catalog doesn't have. So this registry goes beyond the value we can convey with a card catalog, and it talks about how do you pull these together. So in a high-end, in that HR7 example, there are templates. Templates have various elements that are in templates. What you want to do is have that template also have the element related to the repository for that element, so that as that changes, the template is in sync with it. And you don't have this disconnect that often happens. And in fact, what we need to do is make sure that the registry, ideally, ultimately, as it goes forward, can provide the robust support for the full life cycle of the asset. So it isn't just a version, but sometimes things split in a registry that go back, and you need to be able to keep up with those evolutions rather than just one aspect, which is the version of those assets. Again, we're talking about things that are, they're aspiration for where we want to go. And part of what we need to do is to allow the user communities to begin to say what's important and how important it is. Even to the point of, with registries, what are the things you're tagging with? Because we can't come in and say, oh no, but one thing in the repository is yours, there's 100 things that you need to add. We'll just kill it. And so we need to make sure that there is that balance between value that you get out and value that could be in. So that there's a robust community keeping that repository active and up to date. The repositories themselves are actually multiple. They're federated. They can be real virtual. They don't have to be in the repository that's far apart. Because communities already have their assets in other repositories, a lot of these IT communities. And so we need to be able to allow them to maintain it, because it's really the community maintaining it in whatever place they have it as a value. It needs to, as I mentioned, cover the full range of code and non-code assets. And we believe it has to point to both open source and commercial solutions, so that the user knows what's out there, knowing that you can't necessarily get that being out of the commercial repository unless you pay for it or have covered it with some agreement. At least you know it's out there. You're not which gives the users the maximum choice. And then finally, we want to make sure we look into the requirements, so that we can cover the needs of both the low-resource communities and entities in the high end. So as you start to go up that path, there isn't a disconnect where you have to shift from what's met your needs in the low-resource, and suddenly you shift onto a new track, do all the conversion onto something else that actually is part of the spectrum. And the final thing, the reason why we're here 3 months after the start of the project, is for a number of us who haven't worked in these settings before, that in addition to having Chris and Paul and Ed and David Levinsky as advisors, those of us who haven't interacted with this before need to come here and listen and get your feedback and understand better the environment that you're working in. And that we're going to bring in the needs of high end later, not earlier, so that we make sure that we build in and meet your needs and needs of your colleagues in the low and middle resource communities before we bring in the high end, which can often just come in the swamp and drown out the voices of those quote less demanding needs, but in fact ones where it has to start in the needs of the communities that we work with. So let me stop there. Jane, do you want to say anything, or should we just go to Boris? No, that's it. That's awesome. The important thing is that we actually have something, not just concepts and stream markups, but we actually have a version, thanks to Boris Kaczynski and his team, who are part of the project and the development, the heart of the heart. So Boris, why don't you come on up, we'll get you started, and we look forward to having your feedback. Now, Chris was mentioning that right now we're not on the agenda at any other time, so Paul doesn't have to sit on his hands because this is the time where we want to start getting your feedback. But what we are going to be here the whole time, and what we'd like to do is to see if we can get more one-on-one time. So if there's a session that one of you or a number of you are not as involved in, then and you want to interact with us and talk about your particular needs and the extensions and what kinds of assets in a very broad sense might be in a quote repository that would be part of this federated system as part of the index. We'd very much like to meet with you and go through it and listen and get the full range of what your needs are in a variety of settings. And that may be, for a number of you who are involved in other settings and other communities, what kinds of things come to mind. So let your mind kind of go and think about where this can be, how one other thing that I didn't mention on the front end slides is we did understand that these assets have different user communities. So it has to meet the Ministry of Health, it has to meet developers, it has to meet architects, and in some cases it has to meet the end users. And we want to make sure that those different views, much like Derek was talking about different views on the architecture, that within this there are assets, so we need to understand the way and the viewpoints of those different user communities and make sure that there is a friendliness and usability that meets those different communities. So Boris?
Thank you, Rob. I think you just touched on one of the points that I wanted to raise in the lecture is the idea of having multiple sessions and multiple tracks in the same session. So I think the hard breakout group will be one of the good sessions to actually look at hosting and a parallel track as we go on tomorrow. So I know we're going to get quite technical, and it'll be good to get some feedback during the course of the day. Thanks, Carl.
Guess what? I don't have any slides. I'll try to do one with one hand. We'll see what happens. So you're looking at the real system, which was deployed a couple of weeks ago. It took us 30 days to get to the point where we're at right now. 30 days of development, so less than what we can. Just trying to put this into context. You start with going to the website where you may choose to log in or not. And it's your choice. And based on whether you authenticate yourself to the system or not, you will have access to a different set of functionality. So when you look at it, it's all community driven. I don't know if I did that, but yeah. So it's all community driven. And the more assets somebody have contributed or leverage are used, the more they will be community oriented, the more they will show up front. Everybody will be used. So that's just the idea of letting everybody know what is mostly used and limited assets. So you can look at what's available. You can also look, we understand that people that come into the system will play different roles using their organizations or systems or house departments. And so everything that you see here is not only user-based, but also role-based. And all of the roles are dynamic and configurable, and the entire system is data-driven. So in order for somebody to make changes, they will need to contribute additional assets or make changes to existing assets and let the system know what roles those assets are relevant for. And so those new assets or those new roles will be on the screen. So if I will start looking at showing me mostly used assets that are relevant for conditions, as you can see that the conflict will change right now. So two main features, functions of the project. There's the ability to let the world know about your assets and what you're working on, and what you think is reusable and what you think is important, so other people can reuse your work and leverage your work and maybe extend it. But in order for them to know, so you need to be able to tell the world what you do. And so one aspect of art is the ability to share information. And then another very important aspect of art is the ability to discover. So we'll start with the discover. So when you share information, you will have a chance to describe your assets in a variety of ways. It can be as simple as you want, or as complex as you want. But regardless of the level of complexity you want to put into the description of your asset, it will be done in a very simple way. So the goal is to allow you to describe some very complex types of assets, like HL7 design patterns, in a very simple way. And obviously it's impossible, but Jim always is. Some assets are related to other assets, and we will give you an opportunity to describe them in a very simple way. The goal is to potentially remove all of the technical barriers, so anybody, non-technical people, will be able to come in. People that are not familiar with any of the formal structures, formal ways of describing the metadata. People that don't know what BPMN stands for can come in and describe what they do in a way that people that are familiar with the formalized way of describing the metadata, describing the assets, will understand and will be able to extract problems and vice versa. So, naturally, when you describe your assets using both structured and non-structured content, you should allow your users to search for both structured and non-structured content. And the way, and that's exactly how so when you search, you can search on the left of the screen. You can see a set of attributes that are currently defined in the system. And the system allows you to search throughout the entire set of attributes. Again, the idea is that the most used attributes will be pushed out, so you'll see them first. But if you want to search by other attributes, you can say that I would like also to look for standards, states, times, and what have you. And the system will allow you to do it. And so, since we've had a discussion with Archimate, so if I would like to look at all attributes that are currently defined in the system that have something to do with the Archimate standard, just looking at that, I see it right away. I can also say, well, show me all of the system, all of the attributes, or all of the assets that are designed for system architects or business analysts. And this is how you build your queries. Just point and click. You can also narrow down your searches using non-structured. Click that search. On that, look at something that really related, and the search is immediately returns all the assets that are currently defined in the system, that are relevant to this project, that are relevant to the architects and the business analysts, and that are also relevant to the Archimate standard. Now, I said a lot of things, but it took me 2 weeks to get to my answers. So when I found something, and by the way, this is an interesting, going back to that discussion where you have the same asset but described differently, you should be able to have that description in the system. So when we're going to the key table, and now from this point on, I can tell you that a week ago, the detail screen and the ability to share the share asset screen were completely different. And so many thanks to Paul Bianchi for helping us to define some of the usability improvements for John and Boston. You will notice all of them. So all of the attributes that were defined you will see what was defined, so that the information is divided into a number of subcategories. One is the basic information category, which will require, so you need to provide a title, an abstract, and a URI of the physical asset location. Now, if I point to any any of the information, it will tell me who populated the information, what was changed, so it keeps track of every single change to the system. Who did it went what? Same to the attribute itself. Who created an attribute? Who populated the values for it? So you'll be able to lock down your meta models. You'll be able to create your own taxonomy and allow other people to use it or not. It's entirely up to you. So when you look at this, you'll see a variety of attributes. The question is, so how did you get them all there? Well, let us go into the edit mode, and I'll show you how to make changes to an asset. Or you can take any asset that you see in the system and say, hey, I have a similar type of an artifact I would like to describe, but I don't want to start from scratch. I would like to start from a model that is already in the system and maybe make a couple of changes. And so I can move the main artifact and say, use it as a template. And it will allow me to make changes to create another asset. And let's call it something more. And continue making changes. So you continue making changes. When you look at the list of available artifacts, you can see that some of them you may want to add additional values or change values or add additional attributes that are not there. And the way you are doing it, you can start search for an attribute. If you see that the attribute you need to add is not there, you simply start typing. Let's say I start typing English. It's really, I'm sorry for it, it's not my computer, so I'm not used to it. So if I start typing, it immediately suggests a relevant set of attributes and their values. And so I can simply click on the value that I find is there, and it will add that attribute with that value or not.
What happens if you just select the attribute?
It will add just the attribute, so you can populate a new value.
That's a lot.
I was waiting for your feedback on that. Because, thank you. Thank you very much. So right, I mean, you can now, instead of all those buttons that all didn't know what to do, you actually figured it out and do this. But you know, one thing, you design it, and that's what we've done, and then we started using it, and we populated all of the assets. You see there, those are real assets that Chris and history provided to us. But it took us some time to really quickly realize that while the system is fully operational, the usability aspects we decided to be better. And we changed that just recently. So now we can remove about English obviously, but you can remove the or if you want to attach another attribute, now it's a simple point and click. And now it's not a audience, and let's say it's a developer. You start typing, you need to suggest something that you can use. So, again, the idea was to make it as usable as possible, to remove all barriers of entry, so you don't really need to have a great user reference system, because nobody needs to make it. So you can come in and really understand how to use it. Now, in addition to describing your asset, you may want to describe the relationships to other assets in the system. And as you can see, this particular asset has a relation, it's part of a project. So it says it's part of a project. And It's an alternative to run the healthcare enterprise architecture project because it's just a different format. And you can create as many, this is how you add a relationship. The types of relationships that are available, you can say that this particular asset requires another asset or group of assets, or it is required by something else. Now keep in mind that all the relationships that you define here are bidirectional. So once you define it here, the other assets, if you go there, it will point to this asset in a reverse relationship format. So if you say that this asset requires something else, automatically there will be a new relationship created for another asset saying that it is required by something else. So this is how you can start automating somebody else's work. If you depend on somebody else's work, you can clearly state it. If this is a new version which replaces the previous version, version 3 versus version 2 in HL7 format, then you can say it. You can say that it was a new version. It's actually essentially the same thing, but it replaces the old version. Or you can say that it augments or it references another asset. So all types of relationship you can imagine, they're defined here. And if you can imagine something else, we'll be glad to get your feedback. And then when you define that it's actually, or it's a derivative work of something, and so you start typing, and it will suggest, it will immediately find and suggest relevant assets that are stored in the registry. So this is what it takes to create a new asset. Again, regardless of the complexity of the model, you can easily point to click and create new attribute types. And I'll show you that. Create a completely new attribute type. So let's say there's not a single attribute that will host the information you would like to store for this asset, how you would like to describe it. So you need to create a completely new attribute type. And so you can look a new, add new attribute, and you can name it, provide a definition, define the data type for it, define the cardinality, whether you can have only one attribute of this type for each asset by description. You don't have multiple descriptions. But in some other assets, you may have multiple cardinality levels. So if you describe the audience, clearly you may have multiple audiences for each asset. And then the visibility, whether it's, you would like to let everybody see it and use it, or it's private only for you, or you can restrict it and then define the access controls. And you can change it over time. So if you're working on your model, for now you can make it first private and open it to your team, and then when your taxonomy is ready for the private time, you open it to the world. Just one use cases. Because I knew you had classification.
Do you have any plans to check the accuracy of stuff that's entered in by the supporters?
That's the perfect question, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this is a role-based system. And so some roles are contributors, some roles are just people using it, and some roles are curators, people that will govern the company. Otherwise, it will eventually become garbage. Now, we have it all the time. We have the means for people to do it. The small thing left is to have those people energized enough to actually do this. Now, that part is not figured out yet, of course. But people like you will be able to get in and play that role of a curator and make sure that the content that is defined here is coherent and usable.
Could you tell us a little bit about the distinction between curation and grading?
Right. So some other components of the system that I didn't talk about yet they have to do with the social, not proper social, I don't know what's the right word, how to call it right, but it has to do with people working together on this. And so I don't want to use, specifically, I don't want to use any over-engineered and overused terms, so we don't have any connection to some social applications that are out there. But the idea is similar. So we're building a community, and the key point of this is not the technology. The technology is just a facilitator for the community to do what they need to do. And so for the community features, we have the ability to say, look, I like this asset, and you click on it, and the system will register that you like the asset, and will tell other people know that you like it. Or you can say, I would like to follow it, or I'm using it. And of course, that brings some level of ratings for rating system, which is not part of the current system itself. We won't say that we're rating the assets. But we would like to allow the community to somehow validate the accuracy and validate the usability of what they see there. Now, but that's different from the actual curation process of people that are going in there and making changes to content that is there, saying, look, this is wrong, or this is right, and I'm going to lock it at that level, and I will not allow other people to change it, maybe only to use it. So there are two aspects of the community involvement, engagement. One is more of a passive role, just telling the world how they feel, the importance of what they see there, the accuracy of what they see there, how it is relevant to what they do. And other is more of an active role, that people will actually make changes to the content that is not theirs, but for the common good.
So one of the things is that this is an early version. It's imperfect. We don't know how it's imperfect. That's where we need to talk. You notice that right now it's data entry. We don't have tools that we eventually want to have where you can put an asset in and start automatically populating, although Boris may already have something. But that's where we want to go to make it easier and easier. But until then, it's the early adopters, those of you who really like to take something early that has also rewards, and you want to find all those resources to help to get it better and better. Those are the first ones we're looking at the question. We don't expect all of you necessarily to step up. Got other things, this may not be where you're going to be. What we need are to find those first few stepping out of the box to start tweaking. Because there may be things about regions, or there may be things about curation that we haven't yet discovered. We're going to discover them. And it's with that feedback loop that we can begin to see what this needs to have and what things we haven't thought of that you already are doing in your community and it doesn't get support. Because those are things that are important for us to hear about. Because we need to make sure it already meets everything we're doing and begins to anticipate things you haven't yet been able to do in your community. It's the things you don't even know you're going to start doing in your community. You need to be able, to the degree possible, to have the architectural structure to allow it to add those kinds of capabilities. So this, in a sense, this is the early version. Think of it as looking at the early version of the World Wide Web and browsers, which evolved to be much easier to use, much more sophisticated. This is meant to support you and others who are going to be using the kinds of assets that you're using. And we're going to run into some interesting periods of time where we're going to have a tension between the needs. I need that asset that is maintained by that community over there. And I need 5 fields that they don't find useful to them, but I find it useful. And how do we begin to negotiate? How can we find ways going forward? How do we get the dialogue? The hard part, as Boris said, is not the technology. The hard part is beginning to understand the human dynamics of these different communities and beginning to evolve as we move forward and as you teach us the things that you're doing in the community.
I've got two comments, and I'll betray my background with one. I noticed the author of the document you showed was listed as Chris Seaver's Commonly Walker. Do you support multiple authors? Okay, so they just forgot to put them both on one line.
That's just a test.
That's a test, yeah. And the other comment is, I think, for the curation, you might want to consider splitting the role into that of curator and reviewer, and very tightly control those you're allowed to make changes, but invite people to review and provide comments that are then considered by the curators.
That's a very good point. The curation, the way it is designed right now, is not the role. It allows you to make changes, but anybody can go to the site, look up the assets, and provide their feedback. They can start a discussion, and they can tell the world what they think about it through us. In any form or shape, they feel relevant. Now, the curator role, of course, is more tightly controlled, and so people only that are delegated by their organizations will be able to do that. And so I'm sure Jane wants to say something about it.
There are a couple of different roles. We have described the roles that support that because that's coming in the next release and will be anticipated. The idea is that some of the roles are about managing the community, whether that community is a specific project or whether that community is an amalgamation of more than one project that actually sharing us. However you do it, there's a community convener who basically sets up the scope of the community and describes the community, and then also has the capability of delegating to organizational user administrators the ability to assign roles to registered users. So you could, whether you're part of a single organization or not, if you were permitted to participate, you can actually get to be a curator, which is the contributor is someone who can flip the switch from in review to publish or active. That's the only role that can do that. And that's actually whoever's taking the final authority to say this is deemed to be good enough to be shared. Where up to then you can do it in terms of review. You could change you can take a role away. So for example, you could have multiple curators when a project is in review and people can add attributes or change values or whatever for that asset that are under review. And then when an asset is considered complete, then those roles can be taken away from that group. But just like roles versus identities, the same person can play multiple roles in multiple groups, or one person can have multiple roles. So those are the kind of complexities that are the capabilities that are there to help manage assets and manage groups of assets in a leading way that are not part of this iteration yet, but will be there.
Thank you. I have one is a quick question. I'm sure you have already answered. Then you have a comment about the structure of the tool. So the quick question is that have you built in possibilities for people to sign up for alerts when the new asset has been added, so that if I want to follow up new documents that are added and I need to go and check, so that I don't have to consult the website every time to check for new assets that have been added.
So that's our question?
Yeah, that's it. Follow an asset and
you can sign up to follow an asset and you're notified of any changes occurring to that asset. And then the other role is a doctor, which is a much stronger role because you're actively dependent on this asset. So that you have derivative assets or follow that are expected to be related to that parent asset, and you then can be notified more strongly, or perhaps, depending on the process that's used for asset management, be consulted before an asset actually goes in change.
Actually, it means if any asset has been added, then a get notification. Not necessarily for a particular asset, but for all the assets.
So yes, we expect the number of assets to be huge. But what I'm hearing, and Boris can say whether he's already anticipated this, there's a certain, you have an identity management asset. Now, somebody puts one in, they may or may not think it is an alternative, but they've had tags on it. And the question is whether you can say, I'm interested in one that looks like this, so that anything that's an asset of a certain type, or within the group, so you define, is it an asset within this repository, as opposed to all repositories, or is it an asset that has certain characteristics? That what you want to do is to be able to say, kind of like Google search, these are the things I want to be alerted about daily, weekly, immediately, when something like that goes in. Am I understanding?
Sure.
Boris, do you want to? So what we expect to hear, by the way, are things that we haven't heard yet.
The point is, just a second, I did not finish my presentation, so we would have some other functions that may, lead to the...
Can I make a comment on the structure?
Yes, please.
Okay, so can I please do that? Okay, while I was going through the presentation, I noticed that somehow someone should be able to search for the assets that they want. They really have to have very strong knowledge of what they're searching for. In other words, the structure is left kind of free, it's like a Google search of some sort, whereby you have to know what you are searching for. You type it there and then you probably get something. So the reason why I asked Carl to present that is this is a diagram which was adopted by ISO as kind of a representation of the architecture framework, which shows the different parts, what we call the building blocks, in other words, of the architecture. So from a user tip and from somebody who not so much well versed with the enterprise architecture and all the different components, I would rather see something that is structured along certain lines that are already predefined. Like say for example, registries, and you go procedure history, country history, and then I can search documents within those areas specifically. And of course, there are other things like governance, for example, in strategic plans related to that, and so on and so forth. So as to create a certain logical framework that helps people to search for documents if they really are so knowledgeable about the architecture. So that obviously is an example. It has all the different components. You have registries, you have infrastructure, you have the different, what we kept referring to as point of care systems, you have governance, you have policies, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's my example.
Thanks, that's a great comment, and I hope to, when I'll get back to this, go back to the search and try and do exactly what you just asked for. And because I would like to make it as interactive as possible, so if we don't have something, we need to capture that in a very informal way so we can really understand the need. Take it back to Jane so she can document it in the form of a requirement that Mike can understand and implement it as soon as possible. So that's our goal today. Listen to what your viewpoint is, your needs are, and put it into the system ASAP. So going back to the slide. Now, when you look at this left portion of the screen, this is a list of attributes that are relevant to what you just mentioned. For instance, you don't have, let's say, I don't know anything about the structure of the data or the model. All I know is that I am a use case. I'm lost with building a particular process for a country. Let's say whatever the country is in Africa, but I know that somebody probably did something. I would like to see if I can use what was done with it. So I can start in a variety of ways. I can say, look, I'm looking for something that is relevant for policy. Right? And it already, so everything is here is relevant for the policymakers. And I can continue my investigation. I can say, I know that Rwanda is fairly advanced with the way they design the process. So I would like to just start looking at their content and see if I can reuse what they've done so far. So I will select Rwanda. And now we'll see only content that has Rwanda as an average. Then I'm looking at a specific platform content. Let's say I'm looking at the enterprise architect content or PPM content, whatever the format that I'm looking for. So let's say pull out of the one document that satisfies all that criteria. And I don't even have to type anything. So, and I see that there is a 1,000 enterprise architecture document for architects. It's not specific on the process. Now I look at it and I can see exactly what it is. And I can start using it and say, okay, use it as a template and start making some changes that are more specific to how the contract is enforced. But I'm completely reusing something that was done here in London and that was described that way and allowed me to find it.
Yes, so Richard, what I heard and we accepted that this is the early version. We don't have another attribute that fit what you just described. But we can put another attribute that in fact lists each of the elements within that diagram, which then can tag those elements so that you can say, I want this piece of that diagram.
It's not to change the way it is, but to get that flexibility.
Yes.
Someone to view this in that kind of form.
Yes. So that would be another attribute. So each of these would be tagged by the appropriate part or parts within that diagram.
I would like to say that take it forward for Richard to create those attributes on your own. Once you have access to the system, hopefully after this meeting, you'll be able to easily go into the system yourself and define all those attributes and see if it satisfies your needs. So we want to make sure that the system is flexible enough